Good afternoon. Welcome to the third ACER gas webinar on gas transmission tariffs. This webinar, the third one, will be dedicated to the question on how the energy transition would impact the gas tariffs. My name is Csilla Bartok and I will be the chair of this meeting. I am team leader at ACER's gas department and responsible for network code implementation. We were very glad to see 190 registration for this webinar, and we are looking forward to lively discussions in the 1 hour to come. Please be informed that we may have journalists joining and also that the meeting is recorded. We can go to the next slide. Let me introduce the agenda for today. The webinar will have two parts. The first part is 40 minutes and we will see 3 presentations. The first one will be introduced by Francois Leveille, and he will present the future tariff challenges in the light of the energy transition. The second set of presentation will be coming from ENTSOG and GRT Gas, Kinsella and Alban Thomas, and they will talk about biogas tariffs. And finally, we will have IFIEC on the energy consumer side, and they will talk about hydrogen and risk of sunk costs and cost efficiency. And Jacques van Dorp will present this presentation. Finally, we will have a Q&A session which will last about 20 minutes. I would welcome if you could introduce your comments already in the chat box as of the start of the presentations. So let's start. I give the floor to Francois. We have a very busy agenda, so I would ask the speakers to try to stay on time. And let's see to finish the first part of the webinar in 40 minutes. Francois, please go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Csilla. So, challenge accepted. I will try to speak quickly. So first of all, a first layer of context. We have to acknowledge that the energy transition was not taken into account during the elaboration of the tariff network code, which began in 2012, 2013, and which ended in 2017 when the code was adopted. And we have to acknowledge as well that nonetheless, the energy transition is already impacting the transmission tariffs, in particular with injection fees that have to be applied to biomethane in many countries. Plus, we have to acknowledge as well that we have now quite a strong and stable political consensus that will speed up the transition, and we can see already several policies that have been adopted at the European level, like obviously the Green Deal and the Green Deal investment plan in December last year and in January this year. We had in July the EU strategies for the energy system integration and hydrogen. And in the coming days or weeks, we will have a new EU climate plan for 2030. And very likely we will have an objective of 50% emission cuts by 2030, which is a very ambitious objective and that will obviously impact the gas sector. So we see more specifically regarding the transmission tariffs, we see two kinds of consequences. On the very short term, we see that we have to set tariffs for the new gas sources that may be mostly the biomethane and hydrogen. And we have as well on a more, I would say, medium or long term, we would have to study what will be the impact of a potential consumption decrease and how the risk of sunk cost on the transmission networks will evolve, and how we will have what mean we will have to manage this risk. So next slide. On the new gas sources, I would say that we first have to think about the objective of the tariff regarding those new gases. The first objective, which is the current one, let's say the balance that has been struck by the tariff network code, is to the extent possible, to reflect the actual cost of the networks and to avoid market distortion in order to favor the development of an efficient gas market, an integrated gas market. On the other hand, we may want in the future to have transmission tariffs that facilitate the development of those new gases in order to contribute to the energy transition. If we change a little bit the trade-off of the code or the regulation, and if we want to favor the second objective in comparison with the current one, we will have to justify one possibility first. One possibility would be to grant tariff discounts to the new gas sources. But these tariff discounts will have to be justified by positive externalities. I would say that tariff discounts are just one tool among others to foster the development of new gas sources. You can imagine subsidies, you can imagine other tools. Nonetheless, it is important, I think, to discuss those technical solutions at a EU level, because even if those gases are currently mostly consumed locally, on the long term, we will have to think about their integration in a EU market, and we will have to think about creating a level playing field for those new sources. So if we decide to grant discount, we will have to recover the missing money somewhere. And the best way to do it is to identify the beneficiaries and to allocate the missing money in the network, to allocate the missing money at the network points where the beneficiaries are connected. So it will be, this question will be discussed, for instance, in ENTSOG presentation. On the second hand, we have as well to acknowledge that tariff discounts are just a small tool in the more general regulatory and fiscal framework, and that it has to be, let's say, designed in combination of or taking into account this broader framework. Otherwise, it will not allow to deliver actual reduction in the emissions. And for instance, we will have to implement guarantees of origin, maybe a carbon border tax, maybe a carbon price as well. But obvious, I think it's obvious for everyone, but it's only one small feature in a broader and more complex landscape. Regarding hydrogen, the situation is even more complex, as we have to solve first more fundamental questions, and in particular, the first one is to decide if we will have dedicated networks for hydrogen, or if we will inject hydrogen in the current gas networks and mix hydrogen with the methane. So very likely, it seems that we will have dedicated networks, but it's not really decided yet. And I would say that for hydrogen, the situation will evolve in time, as the need of regulation will really depend on the level of development of the hydrogen networks. As long as you have hydrogen network that are just pipes connecting producers to production point to consumers, there is no need of third-party access and there is no need of an actual regulation. As soon as you will have more developed network, more meshed network, then you will have third-party access and then regulation, including tariff regulation, will become necessary. So it's worth noting that both the European Commission and the NRAs are currently working on the issue, on these issues. Then the last topic, the fact that we will have to manage the risk of networks restructuring. It's still too early to predict what will be the evolution of the consumption and how fast it will be. And it's the pace is really important here. The slower, the smoother it is, the more time we have, the more depreciated will be the assets, and the less important will be the issues we will face. Nonetheless, the decrease of the gas consumption could trigger a vicious circle where the decrease of consumption will negatively impact the TSO's revenues, that will have to increase their tariff to compensate this evolution, and increased tariff may themselves lead to a more decreasing consumption. So if we have such a vicious circle that is triggered, then we will have to study the impact on the remuneration and on the value of the assets of the TSOs. So, of course, one other caveat, of course, the development of the biomethane and the repurposing of the existing pipe in hydrogen pipes could contribute as well to mitigate that risk. Nonetheless, what we are doing right now will not work if the risk of underutilization is too high. In the current situation, we have an insurance logic where the risk of underutilization is covered through taken into account, let's say, in the remuneration rate of the TSO. This reasoning will not work if the risk is too high, too systemic. So if we are in the future, if we are in such a situation, we will have to elaborate policies that will take into account long-term targets and that will, as smoothly and as progressively as possible, let's say, program the reduction, the shrinking of the gas network, and that will allow to manage the stranded assets in the long term. I forget to say something specific on this topic. Yeah, and if we are in this situation to elaborate those policies, I think we will have as well conflicting objectives as usual. We will have on the first hand to, as long as possible, to maintain a competitive and integrated gas market, and on the second hand, we will have to make sure that the access that is granted to the new gas sources contributing to the energy transition are economically sustainable. So on the first hand, we will have the traditional gas. We want to have it as competitive as possible, as long as possible. And on the second hand, we don't want this objective to be detrimental to the access of the new gas sources. And that's it on this slide. So we would like to, as Csilla explained, we would like to thank ENTSOG and IFIEC for accepting our invitation to contribute to the webinar. The first presentation that will be done by ENTSOG is focusing more on the short term, and it's focusing on the tariffs that are applied to the injections of biomethane in Ireland, Germany, and France. So it's already happening. And the second presentation done by EFET will have a more long-term perspective and will focus more on hydrogen and on the risk of sunk cost. So I will let the floor to Sean.
You can hear me okay?
Yes, very well, Sean.
Okay, thank you, Francois, and thank you for allowing us to contribute to this webinar today. It's much appreciated. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sean Kinsella. I'm a market advisor with ENTSOG. I'm going to briefly go through the current entry tariff arrangements for biogas in Ireland and Germany, and how this is encouraging the development of this industry in these countries. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague Alban from Gas, and he's going to cover the case in France. Can I go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so looking at the biogas transmission entry tariff for Ireland first. So Gas Networks Ireland, which is the Irish TSO, plan to have about 20% of biogas on the network by 2030. So the potential for biogas production in Ireland is the highest potential per capita in Europe, and it will be used to heat, for heat, for power, for transport sectors. And when setting this entry tariff in Ireland, government policy on low carbon energy future was one of the main considerations. So the approach they've taken here within the tariff network code is that tariffs for biogas entry points are based on a single notional entry point on the Irish gas system. So this will effectively mean that all biogas entry points who wish to connect to the transmission system face an equivalent tariff, regardless of the location. Development in such a way which is simple and practical. And in Ireland, they use central injection facilities. So the injection is likely to be located near the point of production, rather than having the flexibility to locate close to demand centres. So they picked two options. So there was two options considered for the location of this notional point. So the first one was based on 3 geographical dispersed locations. So they picked the point in the east of the country, west and south. And the second option was a location that would be close to the demand centre. So by setting the location of the notional tariff close to this demand centre, would create a reference price for biogas entry that is the lowest possible under the matrix reference price methodology. And this is the reference price methodology that they use in Ireland. Under option 1, which was the chosen option, which is more cost reflective, it's more cost reflective than the alternative, which would have been located close to the demand centre. So it better reflects the likelihood or the location of the renewable natural gas facilities. Option 2, which would have been cheaper, but would lead to greater cross-subsidisation. So the result of this is that producers of biogas have an entry tariff of €106 per megawatt hour in comparison to the Moffat entry point, which is €350 per megawatt hour, so about a third lower. And the reason for this is that it would be quite a distance. So the Moffat entry points, where most of the Irish gas enters, the system is on the other side of the Irish Sea. So taking the distance into account in the reference price methodology just gives you a price that's 1/3 lower for the biogas entry. And what the single notional entry points does and supports an industry in its infancy, it provides tariff arrangements that are simple and transparent, which is particularly important given that some biogas producers may not be familiar with the gas market and market arrangements as in comparison to large gas producers. The notional point approach will enhance the stability of tariff arrangements for biogas producers and may be more effective or affected by volatility of gas tariffs due to their smaller scale. And the notional point arrangement provides a clear market signal to potential new entry sources in relation to the transmission tariffs that they'll face, which provide additional certainty for the investors. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, looking at the biogas transmission entry tariff in Germany. So tariffs for entries from biogas and power to gas installations in Germany are also driven from policies on climate change. So the input of biogas, but also power to gas input, serve to aim of increasing the use of climate neutral resources, and are thus intended to generate network benefiting effects over the long term. They have taken a different approach than Ireland. So Ireland, they worked it into their methodology, whereas in Germany, the entry tariff for biogas, but also power to gas installations is set to 0. So there they have it classified as a non-transmission service. The reason for this is that the costs of biogas input are not based on cost drivers of capacity and distance. So in Germany, the injection is done close to the demand center, and the decentralized domestic injection of natural gas equivalent of import volumes reduces the strain on the network, as the corresponding volumes no longer have to be imported from foreign sources. And this reduction in cost can be directly allocated to the corresponding entry points. There is a biogas charge applied in Germany, so network customers transporting biogas are not completely exempt from the cost of injection. And this charge covers the cost associated with the necessary infrastructure and also a feed-in tariff that's provided for biogas suppliers. These costs are borne equally by all network users using exit points, except on IPs and on storage points. So overall, this approach does not affect the net income of individual TSOs. Neither cost nor revenue remains for the individual TSO. Currently, the non-pricing of biogas and also the power to gas input is not relevant to volume risk because of its minor monetary significance in the overall revenue of TSOs in Germany. So just to conclude, we've seen two approaches for pricing entry tariffs for biogas in Ireland and Germany, and they've used different approaches. We're probably going to see this more and more in different member states as they want to build up this industry and support it where they can. So then the question becomes, do we need a more harmonized approach throughout Europe? And is it something that should be more explicit in the tariff network code that addresses this directly? And from our point of view, we would say, yes, this is something that should be looked at going into the future. So we support a more harmonized approach throughout Europe. And if that means something more explicit in the tariff network code, we'd agree with that. Okay, I'm going to now hand it over to my colleague, Alban, and he's going to look at the French case.
Thank you, Sean. Do you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. So thank you very much. So I'm Alban Thomas. I am from GRTgaz and happy to present what we did in France, what we have done for the last 3 years. In fact, we have very long discussions with the authorities, with the regulator, to put in place a right to inject in France. So the fact that biogas plants have a right to inject, but under certain circumstances. If you go to next slide, please. Yeah, in fact, in France, so the choice was made to not to have an universal development of biogas, but in fact to do it subject to a cost-volume ratio. So in order to foster the development of biogas where it's the cheapest in terms of development of networks. So practically, what we are doing is that when a project wants an increase of the biogas inlet capacity, either there is enough space and there is no problem. He only pays for his connection costs. But if there is a network adaptation that is required, so for instance, the classical is the need for a reverse flow station. So in fact, he wants to inject in the distribution network, but then there will be a problem in summer because of too low consumption. So when, for instance, a reverse flow station is required, it is difficult to pass the cost to the first user. So what was decided is to calculate an I2V criterion, so investment divided by volume ratio. So in fact, what is important also is that it's a common work TSO and DSOs because we could have otherwise the first wants to connect biogas to his network, the other to his own network. So but basically what we do is that when someone acquires a new inlet capacity, we work together to determine the investment cost that is required in the area that is considered. So for example, the need for a reverse flow station or so on. And then we will divide that by not the volume of the current project, but of the medium-term view of the biogas potential in the area. So it will, of course, be a function of the current production, then of the maturity of projects that lies in the area. So, for instance, you will have projects that have already done some feasibility studies that are probabilized quite low, but probabilized nevertheless. And then we add an assessment of the remaining biogas potential. So that, in fact, we will try to see if we build a reverse flow station, how much volume in a medium term is likely to use it. So then, if this, just a precision, is so compatible with the policy in France today that try to tend to 10% of biogas in 2030. So then either the ratio is good, so we are under the ceiling, and then the network adaptation is financed by the transmission distribution tariff, or it is too expensive, and either we the TSO and DSOs consider another investment program that, for instance, will develop nevertheless the inlet capacity, but to a lesser extent than initially foreseen. And then, if the ratio is okay, then it will be this alternative investment program that will be built. Or there is the possibility that to ask for a contribution from the project owners for the local authorities. That is a possibility also to make up for the gap that is considered with the ceiling of the I2V ratio. If you can go to the next slide, please. Then an injection tariff has been created by CRE. Their aim was double. First, of course, to give a signal that biogas plants have to contribute to the adaptation of the network, and also the fact that a location signal is given to project owners. In fact, 2 location signals are given to project owners, because when they are in an area where the I2V ratio is wrong, if they want to do something, there is a location signal, and so then there is a second one, which is such. In fact, you have 3 tariff level, and it will depend on the area where you are. If you are in an area where that have required the reverse flow station, so that is for us the most expensive item, in fact, for biogas development, then you pay the level 3 tariff, so it's 0.7 euro per megawatt hour today. And then you have a level 2 if in fact your area was easier to develop. There was, for example, only common pipe extension or meshing of networks, then it's 0.4. And then you have other areas where it was even cheaper, so then the tariff was set to 0. So the tariff is paid up by the biogas, the shipper, the biogas shipper, not the biogas plant directly, but the shipper. It's collected by the DSO or the TSOs. So, for instance, there is a reverse flow station, so it means that there was an injection on the distribution network. So it's collected by the first operator, that is the connected the connection operator. So in my example, by the DSO. But then, for example, there will then be a financial transfer, and in fact, a great part of the level 3 tariff, for example, will be transferred to the TSO, because in France it will be the TSO that will build and pay for the reverse flow station. And then next slide, please. Just to say that in fact all that was done to have a quite effective development, not focused more on the plants that are well located into brackets. Of course, develop them first, and then of course give visibility of this kind of situation, and timely replies to project owners. So in fact we have developed a map, and so that is a living map, of course, and in fact that so gives the colors and the level of the I to V ratio. So if you're on the green areas, it will be very easily developed. So then if you click on these areas, the project owner can know to which inlet capacity he can have on this area. But on the areas that are gray, for example, so it gives the signal that this is a more difficult area, where some extra contribution from him will be needed if he wants to go on in this project, in this area. So yeah, basically that's what I wanted to present, a way to not to be universal in the reply, but then to convey some tariff then incentive and tariff signal to the project owners. And that's all for me.
Thank you very much, Alban. At this point, I'm going to give the floor to Jacques van der Worp, and he will present how IFIEC and CEFIC would like to see the improvement of cost efficiency and how they see the development of the hydrogen supply systems. Jacques, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me in this call. Well, I think that the next few years, many things will change with if you look at energy consumption and energy production. Of course, it's not new. I represent IFIEC Europe. We are the federation of the industrial large energy consumers in Europe. Next slide, please. Well, let's start with ENTSOG tariffication first. If we go back to, I think it was 2009, we had a gas regional initiative meeting in Bonn. That was really the starting point of the network codes. And it was quite easily decided to have a network code on capacity allocation and things like that. But there was one hot potato, and that was tariffication. So I'm very happy that now we are in 2020, that we have established a tariff harmonization system. And why? Because we now have transparency. We can understand what are the costs and the efficient costs of networks, how they are established. And from that point of view, we can really understand also in having the enormous developments for the next coming years. What could be the consequences if you look at tariffs? We believe in markets. Of course, industry operates in markets every day. We buy feedstock, we buy energy, and then we produce products, and that's all happening in markets, at least in this part of the world. And for market trust, it's very important to have transparency. Yeah? So with regard to the market itself, but also with regard to the transportation system. So the regulated costs, they should be transparent. To give you an insight, the largest energy users, the largest gas users in Europe, they pay for the gas transport something like 1 or 2 or 3% of the total gas costs. And for a moderate industrial company, like for instance, tire manufacturing or paper mill, these costs would be something like 10 or perhaps 15% of the total gas costs. That seems relatively low, yes, relatively low, but in absolute figures, it's enormous. Okay, so transparency is very important. Costs, of course, should be cost reflective, based on actual costs, efficient costs. The basis for that, of course, is the regulated asset base and a weighted cost of capital on top of that. The RAB should be based on historical depreciation, preventing consumers to pay, well, we always say not more than once for the same steel. If you look at very old infrastructure, I think that the steel itself was paid for already 2 or 3 times, but there is still, of course, a regulated asset base for that steel. Nevertheless, TSOs fear the risk of under-recovery, where we think perhaps that sometimes we pay too much. But then again, to have a proper discussion, it's important to have a transparency, because coming from transparency, you could understand each other's position. Next slide, please. Of course, coming from the industry, the energy consumers, we have to deal with the Paris climate goals also. And we quite simply said that where Europe, the European Union, and the member states said that they have to comply with the climate goals, we have to do the same being end users. Without being compliant with the goals, the 40% or perhaps the 50% of CO2 reduction in 2030, if we wouldn't be compliant, we don't have a license to operate in the future. But on the same side, we have to be competitive also in world markets and in regional markets, of course, also. And why? Because if we are not competitive, we are out of business. It's as simple as that also. Well, the measures we are focusing on look, of course, at energy efficiency. We already do that since, well, let's say 2000, simply because energy costs money. And in being more energy efficient, you can reduce that amount of costs. Of course, we look also at renewable energy production in electricity, wind, solar, water, and in molecules in biomass, biomethane, and hydrogen. You must know that industry not only uses molecules for energy consumption. If that would be the case, we could go from molecules to 100% electricity, for instance. It's not easy, but it could be done. But we also need these molecules as a feedstock to produce, for instance, hydrogen, if you look at the chemical industry, but also in steel manufacturing. And then if you look at biomethane and hydrogen, I think that if we look at the long term, we are going for a large extent to a hydrogen supply system. For the shorter term, biomethane will be in place also. If I look at the industrial consumption, it doesn't make sense to first produce hydrogen and then make biomethane out of that, because that is a conversion step, and that would cost energy, of course. For the shorter term, we need CCS, so the carbon storage. And why? Because we don't have this hydrogen system, this green hydrogen system in place within only 5 or 10 years. That will take quite a transition period, I think. On the long term, CCS will be replaced by CCU, and that is where the circular economy comes in place, and you reuse the carbon. And why? Because we need the carbon also as a building block for the products we produce. So from now, I focus in this presentation on hydrogen. We think that on the long term, there should be a system that is really dedicated to hydrogen. Where large industrial companies are often located in certain dense regions where a lot of industries are together in a small space. I think that they will really kickstart the hydrogen use. And when this is in place, these regions, they will be connected to each other through a supply system, and then we have a hydrogen supply system. For the shorter term, I think it is very important to really still use the natural gas system, where then biomethane and hydrogen can be mixed to a certain extent in this natural gas. But at the end, as I said, we really prefer to have a hydrogen dedicated system, and for the shorter term, perhaps, well, we would like to see that hydrogen, where it is produced, that it is used most likely for feedstock, because this hydrogen is then green, and for feedstock you can have other prices than for energy production, for heat, for instance. So if we are going to this hydrogen supply system, we need a backbone, I think, as a long-term solution, as I explained. And then there are two options. The first option is to really make a totally new gas infrastructure. And the second option is to retrofit existing natural gas supply systems. Next slide, please. And then if you look at this this dedicated hydrogen system, we think that regulation should be in place. It's not in place yet. We've seen from some initiatives in the Netherlands that it is even forbidden by Dutch law to transport hydrogen by a TSO. So the TSO is not allowed to transport hydrogen because that is not natural gas. So this regulation should be in place. And why do we need this regulation? Because we really think that it is very efficient to have one system like you have now also for hydrogen transport. And why? Because we believe in markets. We need a hydrogen market. And as I said in my first slide, markets are very important to get efficient prices coming from supply and demand. And then if you want to have a well-functioning market, we've seen that the past 10 years in natural gas development, you need a good regulation in place with cost efficiency and with transparency. So it should be regulated like we also have now in place for electricity and for natural gas. And where we will see that flexibility in operation in either using electricity or using gas, depending on prices on the markets, is even more important to have regulation for hydrogen. So it's important that the tariffication is developed in such a way that it is not a barrier for the required development of this system, and it supports market development. Well, hydrogen is then, of course, one thing. The second thing is, how do we get there? There is a transition period where we still have the natural gas system in place. And if you look at this natural gas supply system, of course, the volumes will go back, volumes of gas used, but also in capacity products in transportation. that will go back. And then the question, of course, is the $1 million question, well, perhaps a $1 billion question. Who has to pay for stranded assets? Is that the TSO and its shareholders, or is it the end consumers? Well, what you see, if you look at the first aspect, if you say that the TSO now has the benefits from the system in not only gaining back their investments, but also getting a weighted average cost of capital on top of that. They have they can earn some money with this investment. Then you could say that the other side of the coin is that there is a risk also to it, a risk with regard to the volume. So the TSO should deal with that. But perhaps the regulating bodies will say, well, the TSOs they did their investments in the past, and we generated confidence in these investments in the past, so they should get back this value. They are entitled to do so. Well, on the other side, you could say we are end consumers, and if you charge us with these costs, you charge us more and more with inefficient costs. And if you look at the tariffication of the natural gas system, the costs that are put into the tariffs are efficient costs. That's part of the system. So if you put inefficient costs in this tariffication system, then you have a problem. And the question, of course, is it lawful to give the end consumers the bill? We are not part of, you could say, we are not causing the problem of stranded costs, as there is, well, as the volumes go back because of the Paris goals, for instance. So, well, I don't have an answer to this. I think that it's very important that both the TSOs and the end consumers, and of course the regulating bodies, should have a proper discussion about how to deal with these stranded costs. I don't have the answer, as I said, but I think for the next coming years, we should have well, good discussions how to deal with these stranded assets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we can move on with the questions, and we try to group a few questions together. So I will bring onwards Brian's Hensey's questions and the Ivo van Isterdel's question. And Brian's question is, if biomethane injections have been identified as a means to de-risk the risk of tariff shocks, and if we consider that, and given the cost of developing such facilities, should there be a support mechanism which is warranted? And then maybe a connecting question, which comes from Ivo, is connecting biomethane to TSO networks. What happens with the compression stations that would need to pressure up the biomethane to the high pressure in the TSO network? Practically, that's the two sides of the coins, and I would like to invite Sean and Alban to respond to these two questions.
Yeah, for the first question from Brian, so in Ireland, they've gone ahead, they built pilot projects. It's gone fairly successful. They started injecting this year or this summer for the first time into the network. So it's been relatively successful. However, if we do want to develop this industry in Ireland, I think talking about support mechanisms is definitely warranted. Whether we talk about feed-in tariffs or some other mechanism, but I think in the long or in the short term, to be built up to a critical mass, that yes, that there would be some support mechanisms needed. On the second question, so the way they do it in Ireland is that the biogas will be brought to the biomethane will be brought to central injection facilities. So there'll be a handful throughout the country, and then from the central injection facilities, it'll be put into the transmission and distribution networks.
Yeah, and I can complement the reply. So for France, when it comes to injecting directly in the high pressure TSO network, in fact, the compression station is on the site of the project owner. So it's an extra capex for him directly. But in counterpart, he will have, of course, a tariff that is the level 1 tariff. So in fact, a zero injection tariff, because he has internalized the cost of the energy pressure on his site.
Thank you. Then I will bring in two more questions. The two questions are about hydrogen, and I would offer to everyone to respond to this question. And the first question is, do we need to regulate the existing hydrogen network? And then the second question is, do you think digressive depreciation is a form of cross-subsidization when the natural gas is repurposed for hydrogen transport? And I mean, you can start at will, but I would like that all the speakers would reflect on these two questions.
Shall I reflect first?
Please, go ahead.
Yes. Okay, so the first question, we have an existing hydrogen network in some parts of Europe. For instance, in the Netherlands, Belgium, France, I think it is from Rotterdam to Dunkirk. So that is a private investment. And I think that all these private investments, they don't need to have to be in this regulation. But I think that we should start with a view for the long term. And if for the long term we think that there will be a pan-European hydrogen facilities, that should be regulated, and then it is most likely that it should be a public system with some sort of TSOs, or TSOs simply. Then it could be interesting for the TSOs to get these private investments in the system when that is efficient. But if it isn't efficient, it's not a necessity. That's one thing. And the second thing was about the depreciation of, yeah?
Do you want that I repeat it?
Yeah.
So do you think digressive depreciation is a form of cross-subsidization when the natural gas grid is repurposed for hydrogen?
The answer is yes. And why? Because the consumption now is different than it will be in 2030 or 2035 or 2040, even if you want. So the consumers making use of this natural gas system will be different in, well, let's say the next 10 years. So the question is then, if the consumers that buy gas now and use the grid for that, do they have to pay for the use of gas in the future, where perhaps they will not use it to that extent, or perhaps will not use it in the future? So the answer, if you ask it to me, is yes. Cross-subsidization.
Sorry, I'm just inviting in other views, so either from ENTSOG or ACER.
Yeah, I can go next. Looking at the first question first. So the way ENTSOG sees it developing is that, yes, there'll probably be some sort of clusters or hydrogen valleys. Eventually, those clusters will have to be linked up. So we definitely say that should be done sooner rather than later. So once you link those clusters up and divide it out, or develop a more EU-wide network, this will provide different sources and allow a competitive market to develop. And then it should eventually deliver a common or even a similar price signal. And what the kind of regulatory framework will look like then is, so we think that the hydrogen market should adhere to the principles and the technical rules that underpin the existing internal energy market. for gas, but obviously that might have to be adapted where necessary. All renewable and decarbonised gases should be integrated as much as possible with the gas market, as I said, to deliver a common and similar price signal, maybe something similar to the current H and L gases. We do have to take account that current rules for the more mature, integrated and large market. So we might need to take a more stepwise approach from initial development to maturity. What we can do is we can start with a number of clusters with sometimes simplified trading arrangements and then start developing there. So ENTSOG, assuming that eventually the same principles are implemented successfully for gas, like TPA, operator neutrality, transparent tariffs, these should eventually also, when fully developed, also apply to hydrogen. For just quickly on the second question, I just make 2 points. I think when we look at how we're going to achieve the full energy transition, I think we've come to the conclusion that we're going to need both electrons and molecules, and this would be the cheapest way to do it. And then if we look at gas, if we look at repurposing existing networks rather than building new pipelines, that this in turn is also the cheapest way to do that. So that's my answer to those 2 questions.
Thank you.
Yes.
More points?
On my side, I would say that on hydrogen, I agree with what Sean said. Theoretically, as soon as the hydrogen network will become a natural monopoly with several suppliers accessing the network, so third-party access and suppliers in competition, yes, there will be a need of a regulation that will very likely be similar to the regulations that we have for the gas networks. But currently, the current hydrogen networks, to my knowledge, are not corresponding to this definition because there is no competition between suppliers on the same pipes. So that's it on hydrogen. On the degressive depreciation, I would say very likely, yes, there is a temporal cross-subsidy, but that's complicated to know between from who are the beneficiaries and who are the ones that are paying. Because degressive depreciation means that you depreciate, you have a stronger depreciation in the first years of the economic life of your assets. And in parallel, it allows you to reduce your benefits, so you pay less taxes during those first years. So paradoxically, it means that the TSO will pay less taxes, so that the allowed revenue of the TSO will be reduced during the first year, maybe. So I don't know. That's a way to repay and to make the cost of the network lower for the future. But who is paying in the present? Is it are the network users paying, or the taxpayers somehow contributing to the network costs? That's something to study.
Thank you very much. I'm putting down the very last question, which I would also open to all of you. The question comes from Daniel Horta Erse, and then he says, the current tariff network code had the objectives to mitigate cross-subsidization between cross-system users and intra-system users, transit and consumption, in other words. And do the approaches presented today not point to a risk of cross-subsidization between green and non-green gases? Does this new risk not go beyond transmission and covers also distribution? I'm just leaving it open to you who would come in first.
Maybe Alban, Thomas from Gertegas. Yeah, I think it's of course we are at the very beginning of biogas, so it's hard to see all the implication. Of course, you have to consider that the presence of biogas will or may reduce the average distance covered by gas on the network. So there will also be some positive effect, lowering effect on the costs. So in the principle, then you have it will be the same network. So you have to be fair, but also to consider the value that will be given by biomethane. On the average distance and also on the risk of stranded assets. It was pointed out by Francois at the beginning.
Yeah, it's just Sean here. Yeah, I'd agree with Alban just said. I'd also just say that if we're going to have a domestic supply from these new green gases, obviously that brings with it reduced costs and benefits to the network. So I think these should be considered. If we do want to do something with the tariff network code, I think you have a number of different options. So you could include something in Article 9 that mentions discounts on storage or LNG, but that might be a little bit blunt. So you could go into something a little bit more sophisticated, so a standalone article that would then address some of these concerns or some of these issues. But they definitely have to be discussed, so I agree with that as well.
Jacques van der Worp here. I think you are right. It has to be discussed. It's not as simple as that. Because we need flexibility in the electricity system. We need flexibility in the molecule system, in natural gas, but also in hydrogen then in the future. But there should be an interlinkage between the two also, and not just for market prices, but also for security of supply.
Yes, Francois?
I have not much to add. I will not repeat what I said at the beginning, but that's just a word to say, yes, I really need that we need a debate on those points because they are really, the magnitude of the issues is important. So the sooner we work on them, the more time we will have to address them properly.
At this point, I think we reached to the end of this webinar. I would like to very much thank you for the guest speakers for coming and presenting and to show and showing these debates and the angles that are coming up in the energy transition debates. We see that tariffs have to be rethought and there are many new tariff points that we would need to discuss. I would like to say thank you also for the audience, for the questions. And for the time being, we may meet in Madrid with some of you. And this was the last seminar on gas transmission tariffs. So see you in Madrid and see you around. Thank you very much for your participation.